I can't tell him that. I can't tell him.
You have to.
I can't. He's never gonna forgive this. How is he gonna forgive that?
She called me a liar. She called me a scammer.
The story does not begin with romance. It begins with siren. According to reports surrounding the situation, Daniel and his uncle were suddenly taken into custody after Lisa filed a formal complaint with local authorities. For viewers who had been following their relationship, the news felt almost impossible to process. Only weeks earlier, the couple had been presented as another hopeful international love story. Smiles on video calls, promises about marriage, plans for a shared future, and then everything flipped. Impromises about marriage, plans for a shared future, and then everything flipped. In a matter of days, the conversation around their relationship changed from romance to something far darker. Words like trust and commitment were suddenly replaced with accusations, investigations, and police involvement. For fans of the show, the shift was jarring. One moment, it looked like a relationship moving toward marriage. The next moment, it looked like a potential criminal case. So, the obvious question started spreading everywhere. What happened? Because this was not a slow collapse. This was a sudden explosion. Lisa didn't simply break up with Daniel and walk away. She went to authorities and made a formal complaint. That decision alone raised eyebrows. Filing a police report in a foreign country is not something people do casually. It suggested that whatever she discovered felt serious enough to require legal protection. But here's where the situation becomes complicated. Just weeks earlier, Lisa herself had been defending Daniel publicly. Friends had raised concerns about how quickly the relationship was moving. Some viewers had noticed small details that felt unusual. Yet, Lisa pushed those worries aside. She believed she had found someone who genuinely cared about her. That belief matters. When someone invests emotionally in a relationship, they often interpret warning signs as misunderstandings. If a partner talks about finances early, it can sound like planning for the future rather than pressure. If family members get involved, it can feel like cultural tradition rather than influence. That is how trust works. It fills in the gaps. And for a while, that is exactly what viewers saw on screen. Daniel appeared attentive, supportive, focused on building a life together. Conversations about marriage happened quickly. But in the world of international relationships on reality television, that is not unusual. Yet, something else was quietly developing in the background. Financial conversations. At first, they seemed practical. Couples preparing for marriage often talk about money, property, and shared responsibilities. But according to claims later described by Lisa, those conversations started appearing more often. Joint plans, shared resources, future investments, none of that looked alarming at first glance. But once suspicion enters the picture, even normal conversations start to feel different. People began asking questions. Why were financial plans appearing so early? Why was Daniel's uncle participating in discussions about Lisa's assets? And how involved was he really? Because that detail would become important later. Family involvement in relationships can be normal in many cultures. Advice from elders is often expected. But Lisa eventually claimed that the uncle's role was not simply guidance. According to her account, he appeared to be part of conversations about financial arrangements after marriage. Still, none of this explains the moment everything changed. That moment came unexpectedly. Lisa later claimed she overheard a private conversation between Daniel and his uncle, a conversation she was never meant to hear, a conversation that made her question the entire relationship. What exactly was said during that exchange remains heavily debated. Supporters of Daniel argue it may have been misunderstood. Critics, but according to Lisa's account, one phrase stood out. There was urgency about securing her assets quickly before she could change her mind. And once those words were heard, the relationship she thought she understood suddenly looked very different. The real question now becomes unavoidable. Did Lisa uncover a carefully planned financial scheme? Or did she misinterpret a conversation that was never meant to sound suspicious? Because the next decision she made would change everything. To understand how things reached that explosive moment, you have to rewind to the beginning of the relationship. Because early on, nothing about Lisa and Daniel looked unusual. In fact, it looked almost exactly like the kind of love story the show is known for. Daniel came across as attentive and warm. He spoke about commitment, about building a future together, about bringing Lisa into his family. Those early conversations carried the kind of emotional intensity that often shows up in long-distance relationships. When two people spend most of their time talking through screens, the bond can feel deeper, faster. For Lisa, that connection seemed real. She believed Daniel was serious about building a life with her. Marriage came up quickly, but within the world of international relationships on the show, that pace didn't raise many alarms. If anything, it looked like two people who simply didn't want to waste time. But when viewers later went back and re-examined those early moments, a few details, some viewers believe Lisa may have misunderstood the conversation she overheard. They argue that cultural differences can sometimes make ordinary discussions sound suspicious when taken out of context. In many families, especially in close-knit communities, relatives often participate in serious life decisions like marriage, finances, and relocation. From that perspective, Daniel's uncle being involved might not have been unusual at all. It could have simply been family guidance. But once Lisa's complaint became public, the narrative changed rapidly, and speculation started spreading across fan communities and social media. Supporters of Lisa believe her reaction was not impulsive. They point out that filing a report with authorities is a serious step that most people would not take unless they felt genuinely threatened or deceived. According to those who stand by her version of events, the conversation she overheard was not just about planning a marriage. They claim it sounded like a discussion about timing, control, and access to resources. That is why the phrase about securing her assets quickly became such a focal point. If that interpretation is accurate, then the entire relationship begins to look very different from the love story viewers initially believed they were watching. But the situation is not that simple. Reality television often compresses weeks or months of interaction into a few short episodes. What viewers see is carefully edited storytelling designed to highlight emotional moments. That means audiences rarely witness the full context behind conversations. Important details can easily disappear between scenes. Because of that, fans often build their understanding of relationships based on fragments of information. When something dramatic happens later, those fragments suddenly get reinterpreted in ways that may or may not reflect the full truth. For Daniel, the sudden involvement of authorities transformed a private relationship dispute into a public controversy. Reports indicate that both he and his uncle were taken into custody shortly after Lisa made her complaint. The image of police involvement immediately intensified the situation. Viewers who had been casually following the couple suddenly felt like they were watching a real-life investigation unfold rather than a relationship drama from a television show. Friends close to the situation reportedly expressed shock. Some described Daniel as someone who had appeared genuinely committed to the relationship. Others admitted they had quietly wondered whether the relationship was moving too quickly. Long-distance relationships can create a powerful emotional bubble. When two people communicate primarily through video calls and messages, they often focus on their connection while overlooking potential warning signs. Lisa herself had reportedly defended Daniel many times before things collapsed. When friends questioned the speed of the engagement discussions, she insisted their connection was real. She believed Daniel cared about her. She believed they were planning a life together. That kind of belief can be powerful, especially when someone feels they have finally found a partner who understands them. But the moment doubt entered the picture, everything shifted. Lisa reportedly began reviewing earlier conversations in her mind. She started thinking about the moments when financial topics came up unexpectedly. She remembered how Daniel's uncle sometimes guided those discussions. What once felt like supportive advice began to feel more strategic. And when she combined those memories with the private conversation she overheard, the entire relationship began to look suspicious. Still, there remains a critical question that investigators and observers alike continue asking. Was the conversation she overheard truly evidence of a planned financial scheme? Or was it a misunderstanding amplified by fear and mistrust? Because words spoken privately can easily be interpreted in different ways when only part of the context is heard. A single phrase can sound alarming when separated from the rest of the conversation. Supporters of Daniel argue that this might be exactly what happened. They believe the situation escalated because assumptions were made too quickly. However, Lisa's decision suggests she felt the situation was too serious to ignore. Filing a complaint meant involving legal authorities and triggering a process that would examine the claims more closely. Investigators would need to review communications, interview the people involved, and determine whether there was evidence supporting the allegations. For fans watching from the outside, the story became increasingly complicated. On one side was Lisa's claim that she uncovered something deeply troubling. On the other side were voices suggesting the situation might be based on a misunderstanding. And somewhere in the middle was the reality that relationships often contain private dynamics outsiders cannot fully see. What makes this situation especially striking is how quickly the narrative changed. Just weeks earlier, viewers had been watching a developing love story. Conversations about marriage created excitement among fans who hoped the couple would succeed despite the challenges of distance and cultural differences. Instead, the story transformed into something entirely different. A romance that once looked hopeful suddenly carried the tone of an investigation. And as more details slowly began emerging, people started asking an even deeper question. If Lisa had not overheard that conversation, would the relationship have continued toward marriage? Or would the same concerns have eventually surfaced in another way? Because sometimes the most dramatic turning points in relationships come from moments that were never supposed to happen at all. Because sometimes the biggest turning points in a relationship do not arrive with warning. They appear suddenly, quietly, in a moment that was never supposed to happen. A conversation overheard by accident. A phrase spoken casually. A detail that suddenly refuses to leave your mind. For Lisa, that moment seems to have changed everything. What she heard that day did not just make her uncomfortable. It made her question the entire story she believed she was living. After that moment, according to people familiar with the situation, Lisa did not immediately explode in anger or confrontation. Instead, she did something far more common when trust begins to crack. She started observing. She watched how Daniel communicated. She listened carefully to the tone of his conversations. She began paying attention to details that she might have ignored before. And when someone begins looking for signs of deception, the smallest behaviors can start to feel significant. A delayed reply to a message. A vague answer to a direct question. A conversation that suddenly changes topic. Individually, none of these things prove anything. But when doubt is already growing, each moment begins to build a pattern. According to Lisa's version of events, the pattern she began noticing made her increasingly uneasy. One of the most uncomfortable aspects for her was the continued involvement of Daniel's uncle. He was not just a distant relative occasionally offering advice. He seemed to be actively participating in discussions about the couple's future. Sometimes he spoke about logistics. Other times he offered opinions about what life after marriage should look like. At first glance, those conversations could easily be interpreted as family guidance. In many cultures, marriage is considered a union between families, not just individuals. But Lisa reportedly began wondering why financial details kept appearing in those discussions. Where would she keep her savings? Would she combine finances after marriage? What property might be shared between them? These questions might sound practical for couples planning a life together. But according to Lisa, the frequency of those discussions began to feel unusual. They appeared early in the relationship and returned repeatedly. For viewers watching the show, those moments were never presented as suspicious. In fact, they were framed as part of the couple's growing commitment. Daniel spoke about responsibility, stability, and building something lasting together. He appeared calm and confident when discussing the future. That image made the later accusations even more shocking. Because the person viewers thought they understood suddenly became the center of a serious claim. At the same time, people close to Daniel began sharing their own perspectives. Some described him as someone who had always been respectful and supportive. They said the relationship with Lisa looked genuine from their point of view. According to them, Daniel had spoken openly about wanting to build a life together. These conflicting narratives made it almost impossible for outsiders to know what the truth might be. On one side was Lisa's claim that she overheard something alarming enough to destroy her trust. On the other side were voices suggesting the situation had been misunderstood. And somewhere in between was a relationship that had once appeared hopeful. What makes the story even more complicated is how emotional investment can influence perception. When someone believes deeply in a relationship, they often interpret questionable moments in the most generous way possible. A strange comment becomes a joke. An uncomfortable topic becomes a cultural difference. An odd request becomes a misunderstanding. Trust encourages people to explain away warning signs. But once trust is broken, the same moments look entirely different. Lisa reportedly began revisiting earlier conversations she once dismissed. She thought about the speed at which marriage discussions began. She remembered how quickly the topic of long-term financial planning entered their talks. She thought about the uncle's presence in those discussions. And slowly, the narrative in her mind began changing. Instead of a romantic story about two people from different worlds coming together, she began seeing something else. A possibility that the relationship had been moving toward a very different goal. Of course, speculation alone is not evidence. That is why Lisa's decision to involve authorities became such a dramatic turning point. By filing a complaint, she transformed her suspicions into a formal allegation that investigators would need to examine. That action immediately changed the stakes. Because once police become involved, the situation is no longer simply a relationship dispute. It becomes a matter of law. Reports indicate that Daniel and his uncle were taken into custody shortly after Lisa filed her complaint. For fans following the story, that development was stunning. The image of a couple who had recently been discussing marriage suddenly became associated with a legal investigation. Viewers who had been casually watching their romance now found themselves trying to understand a completely different kind of story. A story involving accusations. A story involving potential financial motives. A story involving the possibility that everything seen on screen might not have been what it appeared to be. At the same time, many fans began debating another possibility. What if the situation was simply a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control? Relationships already contain emotional pressure. Add cultural differences, long-distance communication, and the public spotlight of reality television, and misunderstandings can grow quickly. Some supporters of Daniel believe exactly that happened. They argue that a private conversation may have been interpreted incorrectly. Without hearing the full context, a single sentence can sound alarming. Words about finances might have referred to practical planning rather than manipulation. From their perspective, the situation escalated because fear replaced communication. But Lisa's supporters see the story very differently. They believe her reaction reflects genuine concern. They point out that people rarely involve police in a romantic conflict unless they feel something serious has occurred. According to them, Lisa's actions suggest she believed she had uncovered something deeply troubling. This clash of perspectives is what makes the story so compelling. Because it leaves one central question unanswered. Was this relationship built on genuine emotion that collapsed because of a misunderstanding? Or was Lisa slowly discovering a plan she had never been meant to see? The investigation that followed would attempt to answer that question. Authorities reportedly began reviewing communications between the people involved. Messages, calls, and financial discussions all became part of the process. Investigators would need to determine whether there was evidence of intentional deception. They would need to examine whether conversations about money were ordinary relationship planning or something more strategic. For fans watching from the outside, the wait for answers became frustrating. Reality television often provides quick resolutions, dramatic confrontations, and clear storylines. But real life rarely works that way. Legal investigations move slowly. Facts must be verified. Stories must be compared. And the truth often emerges piece by piece. Meanwhile, the public conversation around Lisa and Daniel continued growing. Online discussions exploded with theories. Some people believed Lisa had courageously exposed a hidden scheme. Others worried that Daniel might be facing accusations based on a misunderstanding. The uncertainty made every new detail feel important. Every small update was analyzed. Every statement was debated. And as the situation continued unfolding, one thing became clear. The story viewers originally thought they were watching no longer existed. What began as a romance had transformed into something far more complicated. A relationship filled with unanswered questions. A legal situation still developing. And a mystery about what truly happened behind closed doors. Because sometimes the most dramatic stories are not the ones planned for television. They are the ones that happen when the cameras stop rolling. Because when the cameras stop rolling, reality begins to look very different from what viewers see on television. The polished storylines disappear, the emotional music fades away, and what remains are real people dealing with real consequences. For Lisa and Daniel, that moment came quickly. The relationship that had once been framed as a hopeful international romance was now surrounded by legal questions, public scrutiny, and endless speculation. As investigators began reviewing the situation, one of the most important elements they focused on was communication. Messages exchanged between Lisa and Daniel became a key part of the process. In modern relationships, especially long-distance ones, a large portion of communication happens through texts, voice messages, and video calls. That means conversations are often recorded in digital form, creating a timeline investigators can examine carefully. Authorities reportedly began analyzing those exchanges to understand the true nature of the relationship. Were Daniel and his uncle discussing financial matters in a way that suggested manipulation? Or were they simply talking about practical issues that often arise when two people from different countries plan a future together? At the same time, people close to Lisa began describing how dramatically her perspective had changed after the moment she overheard that private conversation. According to friends, she seemed shaken and deeply conflicted. The person she thought she knew suddenly felt unfamiliar to her. That kind of